Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. Again, Friday, April 25th, 2025 at 3:37 in the afternoon. So we are going to look at H206. To come back from the Senate with the proposal of amendment. We have our Ledge Counsel Rick Sago with us to go over that so that we are ready to go Tuesday morning. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you. I requested sharing. Annie Grace, I'm going to allow that. Rick Sago, Office of Legislative Counsel. Once again, the Senate has taken something you've done, you worked hard on, and have suggested some major changes to it. I'm sorry to bring this to you. No, actually, it's very, very minor. It's stuff that I caught as my final read through of the bill. I noticed two things that needed to be addressed, and I will show you what I found. I think Herb also could have caught these, but he didn't. He claims to have read the bill. I mean, he's a veteran Ledge Counsel. I'm young. I'm still learning. So windows open.
For the record.
All right. So two amendments. First, the word before is missing, and you may think, why do we need that? Why is that so important? I will take you to this subdivision here. Sorry, Dave. It is B1A, and this is the transitional section that is meant to, and sorry, we're talking about the UCC bill. You may remember the UCC bill, adding the digital assets, controllable electronic records, those kind of things. So section 11 deals with this law takes effect July 1st. It's signed by the governor. However, we have a lot of commercial transactions that are currently secured by something. So we need to have these transitional phrases that say, here's what happens if you have a security of if you have a secure transaction on or before July 1st, whatever date. Okay. So the problem is in the bill as you all passed it, B1A says here, except as provided in subsections C through G of the section, a transaction validly entered into July 1st, 2025. So, problematic. We add the word before. So this is a transaction validly entered into before July 1st, 2025. If you didn't have before, that could be
only be valid July 1st.
Yeah, right. The second edit, similar, is, by the way, ran these by Carl Lisman. Carl Lisman gave me the thumbs up on these changes. D2 in the same section. D2. So this is the security interest unperfected before effective date. A security interest that is enforceable immediately before July 1st, 2025, but is unperfected at that time. We're going to skip the 2. Remains enforceable thereafter if the security interest becomes enforceable under section 9203 of the UCC as amended by this act on July 1st, 2025, or before the adjustment date. So I read that and I said, my issue is this here is the on July 1st, 2025, or before the adjustment date. The adjustment date is July 1st, 2026. So why don't we just say on or before the adjustment date? So that is the change, is we're deleting, striking on July, sorry, we're striking July 1st, 2025. So it says on or before the adjustment date. That is
It's
it.
just duplicative because otherwise it goes into effect July 1. There's no reason to.
I think it's confusing. I think it's not clear if you say either this or that, and they're two different dates, but there's not any other reason of why you would pick one date or the other. So that's it. And then a raise for all Ledge Counsel. That's the third. the third. Even Herb is what Brett Cooper said. I didn't say that.
That's it. Can we amend that so that goes into effect in 2050?
2050. You can't bind the hands of future legislatures. Come on. That's it. And it was 7-0-0 in the Senate, and there was no other controversy. So
okay. Everybody clear? Any questions for Rick? all in favor of the Senate of looking favorably on the Senate proposal of amendment? Or to concur with the Senate proposal of amendment, raise your hand. Okay, so it's 902. Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. And before we go to John, just to give everybody a heads up on H 398, because we postponed action on it for one day. Started looking at S60, which is another grant program for agriculture and forestry products during part of it's for events that could be disaster events. And so we'll get to thinking about that, and do we want them to be able to access these low interest loans as well as access those grants that they're proposing, which could take away those to other businesses that don't have any place else to go. So having some language drafted that says if they access those grants, then they can't access this loan program. And it's for just that disaster. So if there's a disaster 2 months down the road and they can't access those other funds, they could access this loan program.
Either or, but never both.
Either or not.
Right. Well, yeah, I would think their druthers would be to get free money instead of money they have to pay back. So that we'll look at that, I think, first thing Tuesday morning in the race, just so you know. So we'll hear from Cameron at 9. That's a move things a little bit. Okay. John.
You're gonna turn.
Good.
Afternoon, everyone. Sean Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Tried to sit in this chair a few times today, but have been rarely successful. I think everyone knows what we're gonna be talking about, so,
We're switching gears now back to S127 and the CHIP program.
okay. Proposed language for CHIP. What we're talking about. We looked at a draft 1.1 yesterday, and so we had a few updates based on discussion, testimony yesterday. I'm happy to flip through just the highlighted changes so we can talk about as against yesterday. And if there's anything that came up earlier today that folks want to talk through. What you're seeing here on page 1, updates to include an affordability construct, but just to call out what you're going to see later in the draft. This is not an affordability construct that applies to all applications that would come through the program. This is part of an incentive structure. So folks could still get in the door without an affordability component to what they're proposing. This is just an alternate route that you could take. And if your housing development was an affordable housing development, it would grant you access to certain things like an expanded concept of improvements. So you could pursue additional kinds of infrastructure. And additionally, it would boost up the retention of your education property tax. So you could retain more to finance particular costs. So that's what you're seeing here. These are callouts to existing statutes. So in Title 24, we have a definition of affordable housing. I can pull that up, but basically what this is affordable housing distinguishes between owner occupied and renter occupied. The owner occupied is no more than 30% of a household income at 120% of AMI. And then for renter occupied, it would be no more than 30% of a household at 80% of AMI. So those are your income thresholds. That would be your affordable housing piece. And an affordable housing development is not a housing development in which all are affordable housing units. It's a housing development in which 24% or 5 units, the greater of 5 units, or at least 20% of your housing units are affordable units. So that's the short of the concept there, but this is not creating a new construct of affordable housing. Doesn't do something like a middle income housing. This is pulling in an existing definition in Vermont statute and making this available to incentivize particular kinds of development, but it doesn't prevent a non-affordable development from coming through the program.
So, but these are in 24 VSA 4303,
Yep.
which is the, if I recall, the in purposes or elements of a municipal plan. Well, no, that's the definition, isn't it? For municipal planning. That the plan applies to planning types of issues.
I think that's right. This is admittedly outside of my scope, but yeah.
And I did have a quick question on that where it talks about how affordable units are
Yes.
subject to covenants and
Yes.
restrictions.
Yes.
15 years or longer as provided in municipal bylaws. Do we know if all municipal bylaws provide for that?
So what that restriction, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I omitted this piece. For the affordable housing piece, it's a particular duration and it's at least 15 years or what is set out in municipal bylaws. So what it means is you're going to get 15 years no matter what. But if the municipal bylaws provide for perpetually affordable, you're going to get that. So it's dependent on what the municipality has. But again, we're talking about an incentive structure, not a, but I'm glad you brought that up because that's huge. Yep. At the bottom of the page, this was based on your comment yesterday about the definition of housing development. I tried to make this, I don't think that it was circular, but I do take your point. So I tried to just simplify this and also address one of Edie's comments about how you could just satisfy the criterion pretty easily. One building was on the housing development site and met the conditions, but you built other buildings and they wouldn't have to meet the same conditions. So housing development means the construction of any building on a housing development site approved under this subchapter. So the effect of this is that any building that is built on that site needs to meet the conditions that attach here. And I should also just back up and say, given time constraint, normally I will do like a more thorough review before I jump into a draft and think about systematic interactions and the like. Just due to time constraints, I haven't had the opportunity to do as much as I would like for this, which is all to say that if folks like the concepts, I will think about cleaning up and simplifying the weekend and ensuring you aren't picking up weird consequences. But the goal here with this language is instead of construction of a building or buildings, which is what the prior draft had, the construction of any building. And part of what that gets at is if you just said a building, that criterion would only apply to the. So just making it clearer that it picks up all of those, that any building built on the site would have to pick this up.
I'm sorry, I don't get the idea. Any building. Because I think this relates back to the affordability
You
criteria.
could if someone's going that route.
Yeah, if someone's going that route. So. Again, my quintessential, rural development of six, nice double wides in a field. So the affordable housing, well, maybe get to that later, but.
Yeah, this is just. Yep, sorry.
Yeah, maybe I can.
Yeah, I'll wait and see how it.
No, but let me just distinguish the problem I was trying to get
Yeah.
at. So if you say the construction of a building or buildings on a housing development site, I think there's a way to read that addresses the issue, right? If you constructed multiple buildings, then it should pick up the criterion. This is the same idea, but trying to make clear that if you construct any building on the site, if you have a 60% threshold requirement, that's what you have to apply to any building that is on the housing development site. That's the idea. We can return this to the construction of a building or any building. I wanted to make sure that no one was coming in and saying, well, we constructed a building on the housing development site. Imagine a quite large site, right? We constructed a building and that satisfies your 60% floor threshold. But for the other buildings we built, we didn't. Like I said, I think you can read it, the construction of a building or buildings. It should pick it up, but I think this is clearer that any building that is constructed needs to be subject to that criterion. That's the idea.
And just a brief, does this also mean then that if you have a 3-building development, each of the buildings, in order to qualify for the affordable housing element,
Yes.
each of them needs to have 60% or I'm sorry, East
20%.
20%, you couldn't have all in one building and none in the other two.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I was just curious if that's
Yeah, let me think
statutorily.
about that. That's
Okay.
interesting.
All right.
Yeah, because I think the idea is that you should just set it up such that you've produced in the aggregate.
That's
The
what I was
20%,
wondering.
yep.
Okay.
So that's a,
But I think as we were talking with Gus,
Mhm.
that, he was talking about, if you have one of the developers for low income housing, you could retain, he was talking about you could retain a plot in order for them to put a development there.
Right. That's right. An option for a future.
Right.
Okay. I see. Thank
It
you.
doesn't mean it has to be, I don't think it has to be in each unit, that as long as it's 20% somewhere.
Just ask a question. My wife is actually works for a affordable housing developer. So, and they're actually in this situation where they're trying to develop a plot. And they have a parcel in the plot and a market rate developer is developing the rest of the plot. So the idea would be that 20% of the total of the development, however the plot is defined, would meet the threshold. Because they're building, it's all affordable. The other guy's doing a bunch of units that are not necessarily affordable.
the way that this is that any building that would be situated on the site, and the way I understand what you're describing is that you have market rates situated on the site, that would be subject to the same constraints. Yep.
Right, so it wouldn't meet the criteria as described.
Right, or another way to put it is it would have to change. Yeah, exactly.
And for the record, could you state your name, please?
Yeah, I'm Fred Long, Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Economic Development.
We have updates to the definition of improvements. So we just heard some comments about setting out that exhaustive list of particular kinds of infrastructure, which is what draft 1.1 talked about, as against what you received from the Senate, which is quite similar to what's on the books for TIF districts, which is providing construction of infrastructure and then provides a list of indicative examples. So we talked about when I hit on the definition of affordable housing, we were talking about an incentive structure. This also ties into an incentive structure. So what you'll see in improvements is any of the following that would serve a public good and fulfill the purpose of housing infrastructure tax income financing. So consistent with language in the prior draft. And sub 1 on line 14, the installation or construction of infrastructure required to achieve habitability at the housing development site. So this is trying to get at the concept is what is the minimal infrastructure required to stimulate this housing development? That's basically the idea here. So this would exclude things you would think like parks and the like, right? Like this is about achieving habitability at that housing development site. You would maintain under subdivision 2 some of the old concepts related to site preparation. So you could still for redevelopment or development, acquire land and property, demolish, brownfield remediation or flood remediation mitigation. But for this category, so any application that's coming in, regardless of if it's affordable, if it meets so anything that gets through the door of this program, these are the sets of improvements that they could finance with the tax increment. The installation or construction of infrastructure required to achieve habitability at that site, and then site preparation. However, if you are a housing infrastructure project that satisfies a new criterion, this affordability criterion that we will come to, this is the incentive piece, you could install or construct infrastructure that meets the definition of improvements as exists on the books for TIF districts. So the expanded concept that exists, section 1891 for TIF districts, you just have access to that if you're an affordable housing development. Otherwise, if you don't meet the affordability criterion, you have a more limited scope of infrastructure. It's what's to achieve habitability or the site preparation piece. I will say, if you like this concept, it's worth thinking about how to phrase this subdivision 1 required to achieve habitability. Is there some point at which there's a sign off? Like if there's a formal thing that we could call out, that would be great, like a building code check or the like, but it may not be as simple as that. But the concept here is kind of like minimum infrastructure required so that people can live in a place. So you would need roads to go there. You would need water lines, you would need sewage and the like.
Yeah, just getting to that point, that would be the term, that would be the key term. I understand the
Yes,
concept.
yes.
Trying to think if there's any other place where we talk about habitability and maybe define it more clearly. Maybe in connection with rental.
I was gonna say, I thought of Title IX.
Yeah, that's what I was
But I
thinking.
didn't see anything useful there.
Yeah,
Um,
good.
I wonder if Damien might. There are folks in my office, I could maybe ask if there's something.
Yeah, I'll take a look, but yeah, because offhand, habitability seems maybe might be a little too restrictive because, like you mentioned, a driveway or a road or something. Well, I'm not sure that that's absolutely, well, it depends on how you look at habitability, I suppose. I think of it in terms of, is your rental unit habitable?
No,
Road might not come within that, right? So it's something to think about.
Yep, yeah, and you're thinking about the right question. I mean, that's why I specifically said if this is a concept people like working out this concept, trying to get at minimal infrastructure that stimulates housing development, that's the idea. But we can find cleaner or ways to reference existing law. I think that's a wonderful thing to do. Yeah.
I had been reading that as intentionally broad because the thought was, well, we don't know what exactly every single site might need. But if your description of it was different from my take, so I'm glad you called that out, that it was about a minimum.
Yeah.
requirement, And I had thought of it as being different, strokes for different sites, that kind of a thing.
I mean, conceivably could account for differences among sites, but I do want to say it is intended to be a limited category
Yeah.
because habitability is a low threshold to me, right? Like it wouldn't be things like multimodal facilities or
Right. So we had things like lighting,
Playground.
playgrounds,
Yeah.
some elements that might have.
right. I was thinking of it as core things that are required to inhabit a place. So what are,
Yeah.
You're not looking for feedback on a concept, right? Yeah. All right.
Sure, why not?
Oh, okay. I gotta think about it a little more. Sounds too restrictive, I think if we want to, I get the concept of having an incentive if you got an affordable unit. I mean, I have some questions about the feasibility of doing the affordability criteria, depending on how you construct it, but even if you do, habitability, the original concept I heard folks talking about was sort of essential things, that infrastructure was essential to the housing development versus things that were non-essential, I guess. It sounds to me like habitability might be a little bit too low because there might be a lot of infrastructure that is really kind of necessary for the project that might not meet the definition of habitability. Unless we find a really dry, I don't know.
I share the concern, sir.
Me too.
How would this relate to Bob Flint's concern with his Park Street School project, where he's looking at repurposing and retrofitting a historic structure and extracting some affordable housing or other housing out of it? And I mean, it already has heat, it already has a bunch of other things, but they need to be seriously upgraded. Would that be excluded based on this, or would that be part of the broader interpretation of habitability?
just to, I think of the issue with that particular example as unrelated to habitability and having to do with the definition of housing development, which is construction of a building. So if you're simply renovate, which is part of what David's comments were getting at, that request to add renovation, you have an existing structure. We don't have language to say that renovating an existing structure to make it habitable would satisfy this. So that to me is the holdup rather than something about habitability. It's that a pure renovation project isn't coming through the CHIP program. Does that make sense?
Even if it's creating housing where there is no previous housing structure.
The way this is constructed at this point, looking at new construction.
And you could add renovation or, rehabilitation, something along those lines, if you want to make that a goal. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve with the.
What came over to us from the
It
Senate?
was construction. It was,
There was no,
no, didn't speak to rehabilitation or renovation. It was construction of a or multiple building.
Did they have any discussion about rehabilitation
Oh, gosh.
that you could remember? Yeah.
While I was in the room, I don't remember it, but it is certainly possible that they did without me.
I'll get back to those.
Again, the funds are for the infrastructure, not for the rehabilitation or development. So if the infrastructure is already there, then this isn't the right program anyway. Right?
infrastructure needs to be improved, right?
It's his issue.
But if the infrastructure needs to be improved, would that make it eligible, even though it is?
I think we'd have to add renovation in order for it to be able to be. eligible, right?
If I could just add, again, another real life example. We've been in conversations with folks in Newport. They have clay pipes in the street. It's not practicable to reattach water and wastewater to clay pipes.
I mean, the thing I would offer as help to the committee is just to think about what your goals are in any of the questions, right? There are infinite hypotheticals you can think of, examples that will not be captured by this thing. So I would just ask, like, what are you trying to achieve? And where do you want strong language to exclude or include other things? A holistic conversation is, I guess, what I think will be.
I'm a little confused about the improvements thing. Because if, for instance, there's a site where they have all the hookups, but they just need to be like either expanded or whatever. And it may attach to an adjacent site. Does that make it eligible? I guess, I don't know,
I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you asking if
well, I guess,
the uses to which the infrastructure are put are related to whether someone can get through the door?
not necessarily the uses, although I guess that matters, assume that they're developing housing. But it is an old house site or something that has hookups there, they need to be improved, but there is a building there already.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's okay. The same question as to whether renovation is covered. And it's not.
Are they building more houses?
But they're building more houses.
Oh, then yeah.
More houses.
Okay. If they're building new housing, then they have satisfied the criteria.
Okay. So you can add new housing onto an old site.
Construction of.
The construction of
The thing that's doing the work here is the construction of. That's the language that's doing the work.
And construction doesn't mean that there was nothing there. And now you're building housing. Construction of housing can take place inside of an existing building that was not housing.
I would say
That
if you
is-
want to make sure that you are capturing rehabilitation or renovation, that you need to call that out.
Okay.
That's what I would say. Because I am not sure that people would understand it that way.
Is that what we're talking?
Yeah.
Did you have some? No?
That's right. I'm just taking notes and
What do you,
I can hold up,
or did you have something now?
but thank you.
I thought we saw waving
Yeah.
from just.
That's another-
Yeah, I understand it. I can wait.
My opinion can wait.
It's just the default.
I think this is an important piece to determine whether or not that's what we're looking for. Is it just new housing, or are we looking for rehab too, and providing CHIP for the infrastructure improvements that need to be done in order to assist that site to be redeveloped? I think it's-
I think we should include renovation and rehab. Because oftentimes, especially there may be times where there's one building that's being rehabbed and more buildings being added, or back to the old school thing. And we have a lot of old buildings in the state. And so I think there are going to be a lot of scenarios where infrastructure upgrades are needed in order to convert it to housing or in order to add housing. So I think we keep with the construct of housing, but understand that, but I think it shouldn't just be adding infrastructure. It may be improving infrastructure in order for the housing to happen. Or like, you know, as the higher education market fluctuates, you know, you think about like a former dorm, or you think about former hotels, and in order to turn them into housing, there may be significant infrastructure upgrades necessary. So I would very much support that.
I'd agree, and I remember seeing, and I think that was the assumption maybe of some people that maybe hadn't looked at the language closely. Some people that were coming in to testify about, you know, you got an older unit, old store or whatever in a village, and, you know, that it could be rehabilitated to become both a store and housing.
I think this also gets at something that Representative Putin was keeping us focused on with respect to some of the, I know that we have flooding elements in A2, but it seems like remediation mitigation wasn't explicitly clearly tied to like what I think Michael was talking about with respect to like, there's structures there that people live in, but they require upgrades to really have the housing stock be viable. And I was just thinking of what I think he might be asking us to think about in his absence. Which requires, so I mean, I wasn't sure if that two elements of flood remediation and mitigation was strong enough to address his concerns for some of our more flood restricted towns.
Thank
you.
Oh,
He just joined.
oh.
We're in the shadow.
See, we're a good team. I noticed.
I also have to concur with what Abby was saying. I think that we have a lot of really important adaptive reuse to do in this state with all of our buildings, and I can see us running into some interesting kind of hinky situations if we don't allow for renovation to also be a part of it. And then there's also the issue of you don't want, you know, decent usable buildings to go offline because of an infrastructure issue.
That's how you make sprawl.
Exactly.
I support it. I think it's a great idea.
Okay, we'll include it.
I was just gonna ask, does BHIP cover that?
We had talked about uses for rehabilitating essentially inhabitable homes under BHIP. So we have programs for renovation.
Right, that's the renovation side. This is the infrastructure, right?
Sure.
I didn't know if BHIP covered it.
I don't think that it covers infrastructure.
And that could be part of this, right? Okay, so I think we're making add.
Is this place talk about building energy code, or is that something we discussed elsewhere in this? As an eligible infrastructure, so I think.
I mean, how much of an infrastructure and energy code? I mean, when I think of energy code, I think of, you know, energy efficient windows and
Right.
all that, which isn't really infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it's,
That's improvement to the building.
Right.
Improvement to the infrastructure.
so I just wanted to see if we had clarity on how we
Yeah.
felt about that topic, but.
So I think, I mean, if there's such a thing, is there such a thing as energy infrastructure?
Not what this is.
No,
That's real.
That's
It's like a wind turbine.
Probably solar, right?
Oh,
I wonder.
totally.
Let's
John is
John.
gonna answer.
I mean, I don't think that this is something we like boosting homes up. I don't think that's part of what we do for TIF districts. So it would be like a new concept for TIF if you wanted to do something, not to say that you can't do something new, but just to call out, you know, it's. I think I become anxious when people start introducing like energy codes or other pieces where it starts to become, we're building in other like statutory regimes into CHIP. Obviously, if we can pull things in easily, like with cross references, it's something we did for like the affordable housing piece. Like if we can just call something out, but the moment that you start trying to build out a structure, I don't have the expertise to help you with that as I guess part of, it's not to say that you can't do it. I just need to pull in other people to tackle those kinds of things.
I appreciate the perspective. That's helpful.
I really appreciate that thought, trying to keep it consistent with some sort of structure. On the rehab, I note that improvements in the TIF rule seems to talk about new construction or reconstruction, you know. So that's sort of in keeping with the.
Yes.
All right, so we're okay with adding that rehabilitation.
Do you want something similar for the concept of improvements here, meaning that you could, like if you have existing pipelines that are shoddy, you can clean them up? Okay. Make sure.
Probably before we go too far, where is everybody on the concept of these two different tiers that we have on retention?
Personally, I'm not comfortable with it. For two reasons, I think. I think habitability is too low a bar. To set, because I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
On the retention, so.
Oh.
If we're,
85%.
we have 70, 85, and then we have 80 and 90 on the.
Pretend we had the right word for habitability that meant all of the basic infrastructure that you need for a house. If we have that right word, once we have that right word,
Okay,
are you good with the concept of having two different categories?
One, yeah.
For
it's the affordability,
Yeah,
Anybody
right,
and
we're
then-
inciting,
correct.
incenting.
And I have a couple of issues there. One is I think it's going to be pretty difficult to administer over time, depending on, I haven't read that part of it, or maybe it's here, but I haven't read it carefully enough. And the other problem I have with it, because I think as folks have said, it really makes a difference what the scale of that project is. I think some of the folks who do larger affordability projects can handle it. I don't think it's really practical when you get to smaller levels, you know, whatever that is. I heard 75, no, I heard 45, I heard 25, you know, whatever. For some of the smaller developers, I think it's going to be a bar that they're not going to participate in. So that I heard some other ways to deal with that, maybe, you know, that David, I think, was talking about. I'd like to think about that, but the way it is right now, I have concern about.
You're referring to the 70% of the education property tax increment versus this 80%?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm getting wrong. I'm sorry.
I
I
just
thought you were
think
talking about the affordability issue.
Can I ask a question? Are the increments already variable from project or from like TIF district to TIF district?
In some ways they are because of the history of TIF, meaning that some entered at different times when the statute had different retention percentages.
Right now it's 70, 85.
Right, yeah, but in practice, the TIF districts can be or in.
Can they go-
different-
So
They may be in different spots because of where they
the top
are.
is 70.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe Jess, you can answer,
Sure.
but I think they could at some point go below 70. They're not gonna go above 70.
So for the record, Jessica Hartman, Executive Director of BEPC, the statute does allow for newly created TIF districts to be at that 70 and 85%. Although when we do as I explained in my testimony earlier today, when we do that 10-year review, towns, we can reduce, and BEPC reduce the amount of increment retained for Burlington from 75% down to 69%.
And
a couple of years ago.
that provision is always gonna stay in TIF, so it's always gonna be.
Always gonna stay in TIF.
So basically Betsy, this is what I'm trying to get at, is Betsy already managing variable?
We are.
Okay,
Because, so you have to understand that prior to, 2007, I think. TIF districts were legislatively created. They were not created by statute. So for example, in Winooski, which just retired their TIF district, closed out their TIF, their retention rate was 95%. And then I think as a result of the recession in 2008, 2009, their increment increased to 98%. And I think there are other, well, Burlington has a skewed. So yes, Betsy does manage multiple different retentions. We work with the tax department, PDR, to help us with that each year.
thank you.
So I think it adds an awful lot of complexity to something that would be better served if it's simple. Kind of going back to how it was more originally proposed. And that's my concern. I mean, I understand the thought process and I understand the purpose, but I mean, I would rather see a simple process and then look at kind of similar to what David White testified about with 40% housing development process for a waiver. And then if each district has a cap, the increment can be up to a certain percent, and then that can be set based on the project, through the BEPC process. I would rather see us go in that direction. And then we could look at the application process to put in some pieces about making sure it's not luxury home developments, but I don't know. I'm concerned about, I think part of what's gotten us in the position of the housing crisis we're in is having programs and having bureaucratic processes that are complex and expensive to both, and time consuming, both to administer and to adhere to. And so I guess I'd rather see this trying to address the crisis with something that's simpler. So my overall feeling.
There's a couple of things I just want to bring to everyone's attention. Is number one, I feel like sometimes we're talking about this like there's no other checks and balances. We need to bear in mind that the planning commission needs to approve this, your select board needs to approve this, the regional planning commission needs to approve this, onward and over. The other part is that we have given BEPC authority to have discernment on these things. And to me, it would be better, instead of putting law in here, is to provide BEPC with guidance on, maybe that's how you can figure out your ratios is, oh, well, they've got a low income project, or portion of this. So we're going to allow them to use more of that TIF percentage.
I don't feel, oh, sorry.
Michael is his hand up.
Michael?
Yeah, I'm with Abby on the simplicity part of it. I'm breaking it up into the two different ones. I think, and I've stated it multiple times, and I apologize for stating it again. I think that we should focus more on a simple process similar to what the Senate sent over to us. I'm 70% versus the 85% or 100% that they're, that was in the original is not nearly as important, as it's super simple for municipalities to look at and move forward. So I think that if we add that tier structure, it will confuse things, which you know. Although I like going up to 85%.
I think the process in that market rate realm with the 70% seems like it could be simple enough for people that want to do that. I feel like I don't know if the move to 80 is going to incentivize people who would otherwise have only done market rate to decide to dip their toe into the income restricted realm with its covenants, and when that will be determined by what's on the books in each municipality where the project takes place. Since it seems like so much of this is going to be about a dialogue between a developer and municipality for a specific site. So I think that as long as, so far, it seems like if we can help, if our development corporations, planning commissions, town offices can keep two tracks in mind, and then, it'll probably be pretty clear pretty early on if a prospective developer has an interest in income restricted or not. And I'm not sure if that 10% increase is going to make the juice worth the squeeze for the logistics of, income restricted housing. But it might be. I just don't know that. But I feel like it isn't overcomplicating it. So I feel okay with this as is, knowing that we're extending to that small scale, the same stuff we're extending to the big TIF. I would have liked a larger number, but if this also helps us have this conversation in other rooms in the State House, then I appreciate that as well.
How do they understand what the issue is? We're talking about the education private tax insurance and having the increment differ. Depending on whether it's an affordable project. I agree with, what Jonathan said about not knowing whether that would be all that meaningful. I do think that there needs to be some type of an exemption for smaller developments, because I think a smaller development is really not going to make the financing work enough, 8, 10, whatever. They're going to all go into that 70 because they're not going to be able to, number one, design it because they're just a small project, small developer. And this might apply, this idea of a small development exemption might apply maybe to, I haven't read the whole thing. It might apply to other areas where we're trying to construct a rule for good purposes, but it just might not be feasible for some small projects that are still needed because they still provide housing.
Yeah, I don't think that that's unreasonably complicated. And so, and I do like having something in there that hopefully incentivizes people to do the affordability piece of it. And I do hear Herb's piece around really small developers. I mean, developers in my communities are going to build 8 to 10 houses. And, because there are no plots of land bigger than that. And so, I like the idea of some kind of exemption or something to make that work for them.
Do you guys want to see other things?
We need to give you direction on whether you should work on this.
Yeah. I didn't mean to cut off. I just mean, we're just in the definition section and hadn't even gotten to the substantive thing that actually sets that thing out.
Yeah, I think we need to understand what direction the committee wants to go in, because it may be a moot point to go through the rest of it.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
So, I think something that during the discussions we had with David was, how can we move some of these thoughts into the application process?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I really like the idea of having kind of what David was talking about, where the program itself, there's a lot of flexibility, but then as you were saying, we start look at the application process where there's a little bit more oomph behind the intention language. I just think there's so many scenarios. It's really difficult to, the more specific we are in the legislation, the more situations there are going to be where it's not a fit.
I think that the application process is an interesting place to put some of this. I do want to be mindful of some of the smaller developers in the municipalities in their capacity to be able to administer all of this, because some of our municipalities are at the point where like just having to make the phone call, it's like a lot of work. Sure.
So are we still just on the differential retained excess, not the improvement? Right, difference? Right. Okay.
Go through the rest of it.
Okay, so I'll pause this while I jump to the next highlighted text, which is your housing infrastructure agreement. You might not have expected to see this today, but I was trying to think of how do you build in the affordability piece and how can you make this minimally administratively burdensome. And so one piece you could think about doing is building into that agreement the affordability constraints, right? So what this new language does is provide terms to ensure that throughout the life of that housing development cycle, until all debtors retired, any housing unit within the housing development be offered exclusively as a primary residence. So that's separate from the affordability piece, but this was one concept about if you were trying to achieve primary residence, you would have as a constraint within the agreement that until the debtors retired, offered as a primary resident. And then the other piece directly to the supportability constraint that any housing development receiving approval as an affordable housing development, satisfy the conditions of that section, which basically means you're building into the housing infrastructure agreement terms that ensure folks build in covenants for that 15 years of bylaws achieving affordability. So this is a way of doing it that's different than having it. Obviously, you'll have to have the application itself approved, right? The plan would have to set out that you're going for this affordable housing development, but the agreement itself would contain terms on this front. And the way that I thought about this, and again, it's been limited thought on my part just with time pressure, but this kind of puts the hook on the agreement rather than, Pepsi to come in and check off these things, right? Like it's in the agreement that you have these terms.
And so my question on that is does 4303 just articulate what affordable housing development is, or does it also include, and here's who confirms that?
So this is literally a definition section.
Right.
And it just says the things that we talked about, which is that 80% AMI, 120% AMI for owner occupied, and then the piece that you speak about, the covenants to ensure affordability for a particular time duration.
The covenant time duration, it's just a definition, and it does not include which is the remit of some state entity to assess.
Oh, you mean who is doing the thing? I think it's literally like that you provide in the contract for the.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right, so that is, so it's forward.
But I mean, I think it's a good question, like who is aware of it? The first that comes to mind is I think of VHFA as having knowledge on these fronts, but I hesitate to say who definitively would have the best knowledge of the housing.
So sort of thing that if the likeliest entities that are utilizing this are entities that are currently doing this work, then they would assuredly have all the stuff. But if it was a new entrant, if it's, would they necessarily have to find some other party that verifies what they're, that it's meeting those conditions? And I was just curious if the statute had said anything about that.
Because this is just a reference to the definition section, the answer is no, it doesn't, but it might be that the broader scheme could include things. I mean, the other question you might ask here is if you build these terms in, who is incentivized to enforce them, right? Like if it's a negotiation between the muni, the developer and the sponsor, and they just want this to get through the door, like why would one party sue to enforce this particular constraint? Now, the way that would happen, right, is that someone doesn't provide the covenants within the and it would be public, right? It would be known that that's what you're pursuing. So there might be some political pressure angle to it. But I do think it's a question.
It shows up in the language of the lease terms. It shows up in the language of the deeds. So that may be that's just how it, when Paydick or whatever it is that looks through stuff when you buy a house, they're going to catch it because that's their job, is to do all that contract and language review.
It's the way that I think about it. But again, this is just a concept for folks to consider if this, no, and I appreciate the question, just if this is a avenue for, if folks have the appetite for affordability, this is a place you could hang it that is different than setting up an apparatus to continually monitor and check in. Just have it in the
I
terms.
got my heads around it now, so thank you.
We're in the housing infrastructure agreement section.
So I think how do we articulate that in B, we're talking about affordable housing, which is lower income housing. The worry for some is that we utilize this chip and utilizing ed fund dollars to build high-end housing.
Yeah.
How do we articulate that we want middle income housing as well?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things you could do. One is you could have a modified concept for, like, instead of having put aside that you have this affordable housing concept here, you could use a similar construct, but that has boosted AMIs, right? Or boosted household income. So instead of 80, 150, instead of 120, 200. You can create something like that. We do have a middle income housing program, but I don't think you could latch that onto this. This is something that came up on the Senate side, but you could, if you want to achieve middle income housing, that's particularly what you wanted to incentivize. You could just use a different definition of affordable housing. You could call it middle income housing, right? So you could do a concept like that. Another thing you could do, the concern is just to get at the high end. And it could be, it's not that we're trying to incentivize particular things, it's that we're trying to not allow the program to be accessible for things we don't want.
Well, I'm really not, I don't mind the high end because there's a need for that too. But there's a huge need for that middle.
Yeah.
You know, we provide a lot on the low end, and market forces generally provide for the high end. I think what we wanted to is provide for the middle. I think the ends are covered. It's just that there's no fluff in the middle.
So you could also make this, if you have an incentive route that folks can go, instead of prescribing a particular minimum that they have to achieve, just prohibiting the higher, right? Like if you do the incentive scheme, it's like up to 500, whatever the figure is, you could just have a cap on what could be offered under the incentivized scheme. Again, the question will be sort of the question phrased earlier, which is like, how does the incentive from the extra increment compare against the differential in what they can offer the property? And so like there's just going to be an economic question as to what actually produces that. And until you have some kind of answer to that question, it would be hard to set that figure, right? Which is, I think, the safety of pointing to something like an existing definition of affordable housing, but yeah. But it is an open question whether that gap.
Right, but if that incentive is also not just the higher percentage, but it's also the increased thing that you could spend on. Right.
Well, the increased improvements.
Yeah, the increased definition of improvement.
Maybe I didn't hear David quite correctly, but my sense is that he was thinking about addressing these kinds of issues around affordability and primary residence, sort of about the legislative body decision-making, which I think will be actually a little more compatible. I can't remember the definition of affordable housing in the municipal planning and regional planning section. I can't remember. I don't think it's all that regulatory. I think it you know, they have elements of the plan that need to be touched on and described in the town plan. And they want towns to take into consideration, you know, affordable housing, which is why they have that definition.
Yeah.
And so I'm a little worried that, so we use that definition in sort of a very different way. And I think what David was talking about was putting in the previous section of the program, you know, when the legislative body has to decide, give some guidance to them about what this is really intended for, so that they can weed out the McMansions or whatever. And they can focus on low and moderate income and primary residence. That's what I was hearing from them. If we want to do more with that, you know, we could maybe get more specific there, but I think that was his concept.
And I agree with that, but when I've talked about intent language with others, that intent language only goes so far. That and how do we get the point across that, I mean, we're looking for lots of different income levels of housing. And we don't want a community to settle on one. And there's an advantage to larger, more expensive housing for the ed fund and for the municipality, because it drives your grand list up, right? And so it's the mixture of everything that really works. And that's what we want to make sure happens.
I hear you. I'm just looking at that section, and it's not really just intent. This is 1908. And the B talks about, you know, in creating a project and a site, a municipality in coordination shall do, you know, a bunch of different things. And if you say shall, you know, take into consideration or, you know, focus on, or whatever sort of language you want, however tight you want to make that language, on low and moderate income, which I think is our target. Maybe it's not airtight in terms of a regular kind of thing, but I think it says shall, you know, and it gives pretty strong direction for what municipality is supposed to be doing.
And yeah, and so if we can articulate that in the agreement, that these are the things you have to look at and consider and check the box, and yeah, we looked at this. Because Betsy is going to have to make a determination of, did you look at all of these things? And, you know, we're hoping, I think we really want Betsy to analyze these and make sure that we're getting the mix that we need.
Do we have a definition or like any kind of statutory concept of mixed income communities?
Not that I know of. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I'm not aware of that.
I wonder if that is any kind of concept that should in this conversation. Just because I think it gives you like the options on either side of the fence. Because if it's mixed income and like it's completely like full of McMansions or what have you, then that gives you the opening to put in lower income, also vice versa. Like, I mean, I guess if that is like kind of the other stated goal, other than like certain type, like regional continuity and that is how.
I'm probably off base here, but one of the things that came up on the Senate side when they were talking about doing like a middle income housing type definition is that they had proposed using this existing program. Part of the difficulty in linking it in is that it's reliant on a range of income. So it says like 60 to 120, you know, whatever it might be. Effectively, what that means when you put in an application process is you only have to meet 120. It doesn't matter that you have 60 to 120. Like,
I think that also some of the concern too is that it's dealing with the income of the people living in the house, but not necessarily the sale price of the house.
Right, which was another approach that you can take is certainly you could have, but you would, the thing there is that you would need to be sensitive to and obviously there are proposals you can do to get at that, like David was suggesting, it's a logical thing. If you want to tie to median within the area, there's ways to account for differences across locales. If you wanted to specify particular price points or rental, that is a route you can go.
I just wanted to say I really like having it here in the agreement, so thanks for thinking about that. I think that was your original question, like 10 minutes ago.
Might have even been 20.
Yeah, but and I agree, I like it in agreement, but
Are we getting what we want?
You know, it's not going to be everything for everyone, right? So I would just ask again, like the high level question. So sometimes when you say you want to provide it all house at all price points, it may be that to achieve a particular segment of that, the program can't do it at all
Right.
price points.
Right.
That, like,
but we don't want, I think we don't want a project all at the high end.
yes,
So how do we,
Yeah, I like that thought process about like, what is, like, if you boil it down to just a few things that we really want, seems like we really want it to be primary housing, and we really want it to not only be luxury housing. Beyond that, you know, I think back to Tony's point about there's, you know, all these different levels of checks and balances and planning, and there's the agreement, right, all this stuff. But in my mind, I think we keep it more simple. Well, Edie gets a cookie.
Edie's crabby. Be quiet.
I get that there's also, you know, the question about, you know, agreement around the building, but to me, the best policy would be simple and put in the agreement a couple of really core things that we want, and then trust the municipalities and Betsy and, you know, and then check back every year or two, you know, each year, look at the reports and check back.
if you wanted to do something like that, you could just have the, like, if the acceptable outcomes are just not the highest end, right? You could just have a cap on what can be offered, and then other pieces be segmented. So there's different ways to get it where you're trying to push it, but it's versus are you trying to make it accessible to this set of incomes, or are you just trying to prohibit a particular outcome?
I think it's more on the prohibiting end.
Yeah.
So you could do this through a cap, right? Like you'd have to figure out what like where the level is, but
The market will serve those homes, right?
Mhm.
Like, we don't need to build their infrastructure, help them build their infrastructure.
So, and arguably, like now affordable housing just has a much higher cap.
Yeah.
It's not like, you know, $98,000, like we're talking like upwards of $700,000, which is
Yeah.
middle income.
And so high income is considered families earning 121 to 150 AMI, and the very high income is more than 150 AMI. So that's the standard definition of high income and very high income.
Well, I guess also again, there's a tension between sale price and income.
Where's that?
It's like a-
Western,
The HUD thing, and well, you know, that number is a,
we can use any number we want.
that's right.
I mean, when on the Senate side, one of the early proposals to do a middle income, I think had for owner occupied no more than 30% of a household at 200% of AMI. And then for rental, it had, I think, 150, so no more than 30% of someone at 150%. But I mean, it's an empirical question, right? Like, and you could, I mean, the other approach is like to tie the offered price and rents to median, right? Because presumably median, or some fluctuation from median, presumably median can't be just high income. And if you're in an area where the median is high income, it's exclusively high income.
Cool.
Did you say Michael?
I guess.
Oh, okay. I really dig the idea of putting strong intent and purpose language in, and then relying on those letters and VEPSI, you know, focusing in on that and making the determination. I think that putting stuff into this, because we're doing this for all of Vermont, and each community needs are different. I just I'm not overly excited about adding additional stuff in.
So if this helps, I'm just looking at 2024 data for, so 150% of AMI for a 3-person household, depending on where you live in Vermont, ranges from 93,000 to 160,000. 93 is in, it's really not that high. It's not very high. 93,000 is Essex County, 160,000 is Grand Isle, and Franklin counties. Chittenden County, in Chittenden County. So anyway, so that's only 150% of AMI is, and the 150%, and so you could tie the initial like the expected offering price of the houses or the expected initial rental of the units. We could tie that to maybe 200% or 250% of AMI, something like.
What I have, and that is that we are sort of in this, the AMI, depending on how many people in your house and which county you live in, is part of, I think, why people don't get in on the income restricted housing work to begin with, because it's just so complicated. And then if a family grows, like, what do we now? I mean, there's just, and so it may be the case that we'll find that I think as I'm listening and thinking about this, because I was thinking, oh yeah, I had the same sort of thought, and I was like, man, this is probably why we're having trouble getting them, why we have a missing middle, and why it's hard to direct policy towards it when there isn't we're kind of just limiting the financial value of the labor for the developer. And I wish I had it doesn't feel great saying that, but I'm also wondering if we're going to find the right touch to set a band that doesn't bring us into a challenging realm of paperwork. It's tricky.
And could I just piggyback on what Jonathan was saying? For those reasons, I think it's tough, especially for smaller developers. I can't remember who said it though. They were trying to peg this affordability issue around what the housing can be offered for. And it's a way to get at the same issue, but without the complexity of figuring out, household income and keeping track of that and stuff like that. If it's an offer and you're going to offer it, you're estimating your offer of something that low and moderate income folks can afford, that might be a more feasible way to get to the same purpose.
Contract during the application.
I still think there's some value in if the law says a municipality shall. I think that's pretty meaningful, but whether it's in that section or the agreement, I just think it's a better way to deal with the affordability issue than trying to think about median incomes. Yeah, numbers, household income.
There'll be a negotiation between the proposed developer, the potential developer, and the municipality. Like what the project will be is going to be something that's discussed at a public meeting, and then subject to a vote of the select board or what, and so I'm wondering how that goes if those options are more limited by the legislation as to what the housing can be or can look like. And how that may mean that if municipalities say, well, we don't, so now the whole project or the whole thing doesn't work for us. Just wondering how much fees, how will this work when the people that are going to make the decisions about a chip application are faced with this scenario? I'm nervous about it. I don't, it's making me a little uncomfortable that for the middle class stuff.
I'm good with leaving these two as the items in the contract. And then I think what I would want is in the proposal from the town to VEPSI to be what they're proposing, the income levels, you know, that they're serving to be. And then in the reporting, did it match up? So I feel like that way we're getting the feedback that we're looking for. We can't control for everything, sadly. We would if we could, and we're going to try to, but if we can later, as we go through this, understand, right? Did we do enough to meet those goals? We can do better with with our iterations.
Is the ask that you have something like these two, so we can ignore the first one, the primary residence, but that you not have,
Primary residence.
sorry, I mean, put aside, because I didn't take you to be changing anything about that. That is the proposal that for like sub B, you wouldn't have a defined term of affordable housing. What you would have is that the, maybe I'm completely misunderstanding. I thought the suggestion was that you would just have to provide terms to ensure that you provide the housing at the income levels you describe in your applications, regardless of if they happen to be.
No, I was saying leave these two, because if we're gonna have an affordable housing parameter that gets you a bigger increment, we need to have that in the agreement. If we don't, we don't, right? But if we do, we do. And also modify the application and the reporting so that we can check back and see what happened.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you had something like this, yeah. And yes, I would need, there is for instance, for the 10-year check-in, which you would want something better than that, but for the 10-year check-in, there's an assessment if you've satisfied, you know, these criteria, that criteria, you could pull in the affordability criteria, obviously it's one of those.
So we have two people here that sit on the planning commission. Let's go down to the town level. What is in your town plan? You must have areas that you have in your plan of where you want to see growth and where you want to see housing, right?
Yep.
And in the town plan, do you describe what type of housing you're looking for in those areas? How would the planning commission, because they should be weighing in on any applications that come in for development, right? Along with your zoning board, along with the select board or council. And so going to have to meet your plan and your zoning. And meet the regional, well, you can't have your town plan if you don't you won't get approval for your town plan unless you meet the regional plan, right?
Especially over the next 50 years, yeah.
Yes, is that, and then you have the application. Then you have the agreement. Then you go to VEPSI with the application.
That's inclusive of the agreement.
Yes.
Among other things.
Right.
It's a lot of legend.
I mean, in our case, you know, a lot of our code form based, but we also have a development review board that deals with specific applications. We don't specify in our regulations anything about affordability. It's all more about density Although we do have language in our guidelines to increase density for more favorable things. In our case, it's amenities like built-in washer and dryer in the unit or under the building parking, things like that. But then, of course, it would go to the select board, and if we're, like with TIF, we all had to vote on it. So.
Well, you're only gonna have to vote on it if the
Right,
town bonds. If they don't, then it'd be up to the board.
right.
Well, the board would vote on it, but they also have to have public comment.
Right.
So
Yeah,
the-
but they're not going through a formal
Not a
formal vote,
Correct.
right?
If it's the municipality that is, anyone but the municipality bonding for the money.
So where is it that we make it known that the legislature is looking for mixed income housing where possible? And, or that the legislature is not looking to provide education fund dollars for high-end, for a project that contains all high-end.
I know where I put it, like 1908, B one, and then, they have a A through F and you do a G. And you say, this is what we're looking for. Municipality, you shall do some stuff, whatever, however strong you want to make that language.
That seems stronger than intent.
We
Yeah,
need
that's,
something stronger.
it is, there are some little folks out there, but most municipal bodies, they take the shall pretty seriously. I don't know
Well,
if any of
I mean,
those
it-
bodies.
The regional planning commissions are gonna take it pretty serious.
You're darn right.
Right.
That's what Betsy, right?
Okay, can I? You're talking about where to do that. But we're also talking about. Well, but if we are talking about still having it in the agreement. I just don't think that,
Well, I mean, don't we reference, but can we just reference in the agreement
Yeah.
Yeah.
part of the statute?
okay, but then I really I honestly just don't think the affordability provision works.
Right, you mean there in B?
Yeah, indeed. It says that the terms ensure that any housing development receiving approval as
As an affordable housing, development. So you don't have to, but if you're going to, if you're gonna get approval has. if-
Okay,
if we're going this
so
to-
that keys back to the lesser increment?
Yes.
Okay. And I sometimes a little dense.
Sure. We'll get you there.
But then the layer I put on there is that it's not gonna work for smaller developments.
Mhm.
So
So they wouldn't use it.
well,
But they would use the tier one, which is a little more.
Yeah, the last one.
and I'm it's just me. I would like to see some housing in tier two. I think it's really, really important.
Oh.
Well, no, I'm not talking about.
It was-
I didn't mean to
Don't worry about
confuse you.
We still, that's not this. I think we still have tier two in there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
we haven't
don't worry,
got-
we're
we
not
haven't
taking
got
away
to
housing
tier
from
two.
tier
Yeah,
two.
I was referring to, we have two tiers if,
That's an unfortunate choice of term.
and was, my
Ads.
apologies, I used a very bad term there. But we have a more restrictive one.
Am I a little jumpy? Is that it?
We have a more restrictive
Next you're gonna say small school and get.
one.
You guys want to talk about the small school support committee?
We have the more restrictive one, which it doesn't matter. We don't even talk about any of that stuff. And then we have a less restrictive one, gives you a little more flexibility for everything. You can borrow a little more money, use it for a little more things. But you need to improve unaffordable housing.
So affordability, the affordability criteria apply to two different distinctions, so in incentives, right? No?
No, there's a level one that doesn't Doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want and you can still get funding through CHIP. Then there's a level 2.
The 70%.
Right, and then there's a level 2 where you can borrow a little more money, use it for a little more infrastructure, but you need to include affordable housing.
Yeah.
in
And
the
it's
plan.
20.
Okay, so I don't have any problem with the different excess. I do have an issue around the infrastructure depending on how you define it. And the habitability sounds very narrow.
Right.
And
But John's gonna come up with the perfect word for us.
Yeah.
We agree with you.
Yes.
We're on your team.
We are on your team.
thank you, thank you, thank you.
Smart goals.
Big fish in a small school. I'm feeling like very much a strong feeling that I have is that the more we build, the better off we are. I'm less, just, I don't know how everyone else is feeling, but I'm less concerned with that this will only result in high-end housing, because I think as we described, we're trying to make sure that this language includes the what's in existing structures in and around this Vermont, where it would be very hard to take, I don't know, like a park school and utilize CHIP and have someone out there who's ready to spend $800,000 on a condo in it. And I think that we would see some of that element, maybe, Blodgett used to make ovens on Lake Champlain, and now Hula wants to put in residences there. So maybe that's an area where those kinds of numbers exist. I don't know. But I'm also thinking that as part of why we want to ensure that we're including people doing stuff in buildings that are already there is that we are much more likely to see that middle income, those studio apartments, those one bedroom apartments working in there. And I'm sort of wondering if we may, the thought was that there's something that sounds odd about, or a little unsettling about, incentivizing housing in a certain bracket. It also strikes me as that I don't see that being where every municipality wants to see housing development. I don't think that that's the market that every municipality that might utilize CHIP will gravitate towards. And a part of why I've been talking about this, we might be seeing different waves over time, is that I think we may see a reaction in the first year or two that might be different from what we're looking at in the next couple of years or the years after that. But the more we're able to ensure that the CHIP funding can go into some of our older structures that have a lot of potential for habitation, the more we're helping ourselves insulate against the strictly, ridge pollution, commanding vista, 8 garage bay kind of situation. So that's all the more reason, I think, for us to make sure that we're getting into those old buildings, where we have some real structural limitations.
We already agreed to that.
And I'm trying to remind us of that's, for me, that's mitigating against
I missed something.
for me, it's really like, this is why I'm not super worried about the way we have it resulting in McMansions.
I don't know that. I mean,
We talked about subsidizing the high end. I think we're also at the same time, we're not just going to be subsidizing the high end if we put it into the buildings that aren't going to give us a high end product.
there's a project in Newport that, in my old high school.
Yeah.
The building, they're gonna put condos in it, and there's gonna be high-end condos, and it's gonna be mixed.
Yes.
And that's what we're looking for.
And I feel like it's here.
We want to make sure that happens.
And
There's some out there that are worried that, and maybe rightly so, I don't know, but we shouldn't be using ed fund dollars for really high-end stuff that people can afford to buy. Because they're gonna build something that they're gonna be able to buy. Why should we be helping subsidize the infrastructure?
Okay.
So I think we're zeroing in on how we need to do this.
Can I also just, sorry,
No, you
Go ahead,
can
go
I
ahead.
just say, there's sort of like a soft power thing around this that we don't really talk about often, but it's the messaging and the marketing that is gonna have to go hand in hand with any of the development that we do. All of this is gonna be on spec. We are gonna need to draw the people in. And so as we're doing that, we're also gonna need to draw the developers and train local developers too. So as we're doing that, I think we keep reiterating that we are looking for mixed income communities. That is the goal of what Vermont is visioning. And then combining that with the regional planning commission plans and our town plans, like this is maybe one of the only places I've lived that is like, we are putting forth a vision of what we want. And I think the more that we can tighten that up and give it and have something to hand to people and be like, you want to come build here? This is what we're looking for. That will be help. That will also help buffer a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, just again, a couple of things that we see day to day is it's my recollection that affordable housing units don't pay the same property tax rate. They can get a reduced property tax rate, so you might want to have somebody from the affordable housing community, maybe BHFA, talk about the impact of having a large number of affordable housing units, and particularly even a full building of affordable housing units on the ability to generate increment.
I think we did, we had that.
Yesterday.
Okay, and you'd be able to figure out a balance of where that makes sense. Yeah, it's a question. The other, again, what we see is that the average housing unit these days costs somewhere north of $400,000 or 50, say. My understanding of the average rule of thumb for rent is about 1% a month. If you figure somebody doesn't spend more than 30% of their income, you're looking at $150,000 to $180,000 a year worth of income to be able to pay for a new housing unit. So going back to the comments about where affordability is.
The question is, how does utilizing chip bring that figure down?
Right.
Yeah, it was a question. Well, maybe it's premature, but I'm trying to figure out where we've landed on some of this stuff. And the issues that I'm unclear about is whether whether the next draft is gonna see something around an affordability sort of standard, or in the alternative, some type of land out, what you're gonna offer as a price that's compatible with those incomes. I think those are two different concepts. Have we talked about that, or have we? So let me just tell you, my vision is in terms of, I'd rather not see it in the articles of agreement. I'd rather see it in the list of what the municipal shall do. Primary residence. And instead of an affordability standard, have a standard in terms of what the developer is going to be offering them, the units for sale, pegged to, whatever we think is low and moderate income. Okay. So I don't need to push any decision making here, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. It can wait for Tuesday, whatever.
So we have to think about it, but when we start putting numbers on things is where we're gonna get into trouble.
Yeah.
And then, so how do we stay away from that, but still get the point across of what we're looking for?
Which is why I think that you could construct language in that previous section about what the municipality shall do in maybe more specific but general terms that don't relate to specific offer prices or household income figures.
Well, I think with the municipality, I think what the planning commission, zoning board, and development review board, what the select board, what the council want to look for would be, what's the affordability of your project?
General terms, right?
Yeah.
Whether you take it to income or offer.
And the affordability of the project with with the infrastructure that is going to be put in.
Yeah, that's a different.
Yeah, they're
There's
gonna
a
look at a
different-
project and they're gonna say, we can't afford to do it unless you put this in. So then what is that affordability rate going to be?
I have a thought. I was thinking back to the Sustainable Jobs Fund. And is there any way that we could have like, I don't know, the Vermont Housing Plan or something? And have that be kind of its own separate guiding document that we link to? That like. I don't know if you can say it could be required, but like that it, falls in line with.
Those goals, you mean?
Those goals, like those potential housing goals, or does that make it too bogged down?
What is the thing being referenced? I'm sorry.
So I'm just, there's not this, I don't know if this actually exists as a statewide.
Oh,
plan-
okay.
Plan, but like with all of the remapping and all of that, is there a way to kind of say like the development project has to link with the goals of?
I mean, necessarily, and this was one of the points made earlier, there are, different regulatory regimes that you have to comply with to get through the process, right? So this is just about the financing side, but the housing itself would have to satisfy whatever the planning is
Oh,
in that area.
Not the housing itself, I mean the financing in order to get, or, linking the financing to that.
I just mean to say that the only thing that's going to make it through in any case is going to be one that satisfies the.
All of those anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so just been reminded that we're on page 6 of 23. And so we can keep beating this to death or we can move on. And I think that there's an idea that's developing that I think John and the rest of us can think about over the weekends. Why don't we continue on?
Like that.
We are a Friday afternoon too.
The idea of driving home.
And our deadline is Tuesday.
Yes.
So we're.
Yeah. Thanks, Kurt.
What?
That's not an excuse. Have a good weekend, Kurt. Okay.
So we're now looking at this, sorry, we're on page 7 now. Section 1910, this is your project application. Just some cleanup language here on lines 12 and 13 to make sure that we're saying either rather than any if we have just 2 as opposed to 3. So nothing substantive there. But we do have changes on page 8. I've reordered, I've flip-flopped the location and project criteria because we've been introducing affordability criterion, and naturally I think it should follow the project criteria because it's tied to those pieces. So that's why you see D highlighted here. But let's talk about the project criteria. So I did some cleaning up based on the confusion folks had yesterday related to if BEPC could make the determination or if the board was required. So under your sub 1, BEPC to review a muni's housing infrastructure project application to determine whether that 60% of gross floor area has been met, dedicated to housing. But under 2, this is the real change to clarify yesterday's discussion. If BEPC determines that a municipality's housing infrastructure project application satisfies the process requirements and either the location criteria, meaning this is a project that could get through the cycle, but for this particular criterion, so doesn't satisfy the project criterion, the council shall request this board to determine whether that projected housing development will meaningfully address the housing needs of the community, and the board's affirmative determination will satisfy this project criterion. So this substantively aligns with what we talked about yesterday. I just tried to make clearer that this is a quite different route that requires a different entity to make this approval. The biggest substantive change here is obviously this new subsection F, your affordability criterion. And this is tied to the definition. So you've already been exposed to this concept. That's what you guys have been discussing. But BEPC to review that housing infrastructure project application to determine whether the projected housing development is an affordable housing development, which again, that's meeting that 20% or 5 units at the particular AMI figures listed. I can keep going because I know you guys have already been talking about this concept, but this is where it resides. If you're trying to see the core of these pieces, it is that project application is where you should look at this section 19.
You'll be. 60%, I think, is too high. I don't think it covers some legitimate housing projects. I heard 40% from Dave. That might be feasible. But I do think that 60 is too high. I agree with Dave that the Progress Council, I think, should be making the decisions. I don't think they need another board. I'm not sure what F, maybe it is a question for you, John. F, affordability criterion to determine whether the development is affordable housing. Is that a criterion that if it's not met, the affordability criterion, if it's not met, it's disapproved?
That's for the.
It just doesn't meet the affordability criterion, which is not required to get through the process. It's what's required to access the additional increment plus the expanded definition of improvements.
Well, that gets back to a discussion about whether that's the right construct to put it in, I guess. So those are my issues. I'd like to see something different.
I'll just quickly add, I agree with you. I personally think the whole board, this chip board is redundant. I think if we can have a section that provides good guidance to VEPSI, that's all we need.
And that guidance, I asked the HFA, they did not want to be the sole arbiter of that.
They request to the board.
Yes.
Right, but if we change the structure for how we articulate what we want in terms of low and moderate income and we put it somewhere else. And it.
Well, if we're not gonna do this split,
Just to be clear, this is separate from the affordability piece. The board was a concept we had yesterday that's just related to if you can't meet the 60% threshold, it's an alternate route to get in. This is, but the affordability
and so you're still in the same at 40%. So.
Right, but I think 60 is too high. I think if it was lower, you wouldn't need the board.
Well, what if you do need the board?
Because
What if you can't meet 40?
Well, if you can't meet the 40, I think VEPSI is perfectly capable of making lots of standards that I've used. You know, they'll have, basically you gotta do this, that, and the other. But then you also have some flexibility if you had some discretion. If there's, you meet, some general need.
So you're gonna bump up against.
I think also it was brought to our attention that part of the reason why the board is needed just is also because of modern design issues, like liminal spaces, like what is this hallway or is this elevator like part of the residential portion or is it part of the commercial portion? If that elevator goes to both, like, how are we determining what's gonna be the residential portion, what's gonna be the.
I just don't know why a board is necessary.
Because you're still having to get down to a percentage to determine, but no, this is to get around the percentage, sorry. So to get around it.
I just don't understand why folks don't trust VEPSI.
So we could decrease it to 40%, but then keep the board. If we need to for reasons.
In hierarchy of things, the 40% would be more important to me for sure.
Yeah, I agree.
What about 45?
Never overtime, dead rock. Okay. Can always stop. He's open the time.
yes, you guys want me to? Y'all want me to keep going? All right, we can flip next to. We go all the way down to page 14. All of this will be familiar. But we're talking about our retention periods, the use of tax increments. And so for your education property tax increment, you're seeing that incentivized structure here. For a housing infrastructure project that doesn't satisfy the affordability criterion, up to 70% of that education property tax increment. But for a housing infrastructure project that satisfies the affordability criterion, up to 80%. I did want to call out for the municipal, I didn't change this figure and I will explain why, because I think the municipal property tax increment is a not less than rather than an up to, so not less than 85% of the municipal property tax increment. You could actually read boosting this to 90% to be a disincentive. And if the whole point here is to incentivize what you're making available is the municipal choice, if the municipal like this is their municipal property tax increment. So I don't think of it as they can they can opt for more than this, right? What you're really giving them the advantage of is an increased statewide education property tax increment. So I think if you pick it up in your 80%, I think you have done what you're trying to do. But please correct me if I'm misunderstanding the thinking here. Right, if you had it as, for instance, for the municipal, not less than 90%, that now means they have to obligate this much, right?
I think right now that came over to us, they had to obligate 100%.
That's correct. That's correct.
It wasn't up to, it was, they had to obligate 100%.
That's right. It was not less than 100. Yeah. I mean, you can change this figure. I just mean to say the way that I think of it is the not less than is saying we floored you at a higher increment, right? That you're dedicating to financing of your municipal property tax. But if you increased it, it is, I think of that as decreasing the flexibility that the muni has to because they might want 90 and do that, but they might also want 85, in which case, do you want to stop them from doing 85? Right? Like, I don't know.
So they could, not less than 85, but they could go up to 100 if they.
Exactly. You can do up to 100 at the muni if you want. I don't know what folks want in their applications, if that is a common request to boost their municipal piece, but that's just my thinking is like you're decreasing flexibility by boosting this figure is the way that I read it. And I assume that people want.
What was sent over with.
Yeah, yes, relative to the Senate, absolutely, absolutely, yes. Yes. Just trying to draw out why I didn't distinguish it for purposes of the affordability criterion in different municipal property tax increments. I did want to flag the excess tax increment. This is highlighted. I haven't made any change because I wasn't sure if folks settled on updating this. I know there was discussion both yesterday and today. So just flagging that I haven't done anything here. But I know lots of big topics here to think about.
Yeah, we were trying, and I think that's why one of the reasons why we asked Jess is to understand how that whole system works.
And I think what Jessica and David were talking about, if I'm understanding this correctly, is having that they may need the 100% and retain it, and then there'd be a period of time, whatever number of years, where they'd have a better understanding of, what they can send over. And I think they were suggesting in so many words that kind of concept be substituted for this, if I got it right.
I wasn't here for all of it. I'd understood it to be steading to or using the TIF district existing excess tax increment mechanics. Yeah.
As opposed to this.
As opposed to this.
Correct. Yeah. And that, to me, that made sense.
Michael?
Yeah, I would agree with Herb. I think doing the regular TIF district retention is the route to go. I think that's what Herb said. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I agree. I think we should stick to the way it's done in TIF.
So again, if the project is being financed by the developer, how is that going to work?
So
Because they're not going, I'm not asking you, Mike, I'm asking
Yes.
Jess.
So finish your If the developer is the one that's holding the infrastructure improvements.
Yeah.
So, I think Betsy would know what their financing plan is going to look like, and we would be able to assess the types of debt instruments that they're using. And so I think, again, based on the timeline that we presented to you, it's gonna take at least that 5-year window to create the infrastructure. And then the developer is gonna come in and do the housing project, which is gonna create that increment. So I do think at the 10-year marker, similar to the TIF statute, instead of saying where it says municipality, you could just say the sponsor. I think that would cover everyone. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I think you could change the statute to mirror the concepts in CHIP to achieve the same goals, which is that if the developer has only taken out a 15-year note and at year 10, they're a year from paying it off, then perhaps they only need to retain 10%, the municipality would only need to retain 10% of their ed fund increment to pay to the developer for the infrastructure, and 90% of the ed fund increment would be going back to the ed fund at the year 10 marker. But I do think that having that check-in like we have in Big TIF at the 10-year marker seems to make the most sense based on the timelines that we've seen in infrastructure projects in the 8 TIF districts that we have now.
Do you have any concern with the fact that these might be smaller projects?
Yes. I have concerns about the fact that they're smaller projects in that I think when you start messing with the levels of increment, you are potentially creating a situation where smaller projects are not going to generate enough increment at the 70% amount, especially, or even the 80% amount, to repay the debt in a timeline that the legislature might want, which is why we did not put an end date for the retention of increment. Because at the 10-year mark, you might have a situation where you're saying, we thought we could retain 70% of the increment because that's all we're allowed under the, and again, I haven't reviewed Jonathan's latest proposals, but when we were in the Senate, one of the things that I testified about was that because these are smaller projects, I think I testified about that in here as well, because these are smaller projects, you're gonna have less increment to retain. And so that's why I suggested 100% of municipal increment, because it seemed like in the Senate, you wanted the municipality or the sponsor to have more skin in the game, if you will. And so if you make it so that there's municipal increment at 100%, and then in the Senate bill, it was it 80%?
88 versus 100, yep.
80%, that based on data that we had received from municipalities, and also based on some rough numbers that we did with the town of Fairhaven, which presented in here at the beginning of the session, that 80% increment of ed fund and 100% increment of municipality would create enough increment to make the infrastructure project pencil out, and then the developer would then be able to sell the home for about $500,000, as opposed to $800,000 or $900,000 if the infrastructure investments were not borne by the municipality. Does that make sense? Okay.
But if I could, I would have you think about actually the opposite side of the issue. The transactions that we're spending the most time on are actually very large, very complicated transactions, but they're single transactions. The Bennington High School renovation, for example, it's a $45 million project. but it is very complicated. It has two different condominiums in it. One of them has new market tax credits. The other one has low income tax credits. They only have $2 million worth of equity into it. But it's not clear to me how that would fall into this structure, because only about half of the units are financed with LIHTC credits and therefore low income credits. And it's got a bunch of other uses. It's got a gymnasium, it's got things that are associated with an old, kind of like what Bob said, the things associated with an old high school. And we have, actually, Representative Cooper would have a better feel for me than on this than me, but the Putnam Block project, where initially there was a relatively large percentage of housing, but they're talking about a phase two, which I don't think includes any housing. So does that mean that they're no longer eligible for increment if they do a phase two because they fall below a certain percentage, or does it mean that they get a lower increment? And then another one is the Berwick Hotel, which is a new hotel that's I think almost underway across from the Paramount in Rutland. There's a lot of infrastructure that's having to be built out for that. And it's very complicated again. And there's a hotel in the lower floors and there's housing on the upper floors. So again, I urge you to think about the fact that most of the transactions we're spending a lot of time are not simply a developer's going out and getting a loan and building a building and that's that.
We're not, those are TIF.
None of those are TIFs.
No, Bill, Berwick.
The TIF in Bennington didn't go ahead. The Bennington High School isn't in a TIF. The hotel might be in a TIF district, but
Now you're making the case for the auditor.
well, I mean, I don't know. We have, the issue is that you can substitute all these other subsidies, but there's not enough of those subsidies to go around. If it takes $43 million worth of subsidies to do a $45 million project, I think that pretty much eliminates the auditor's argument. You can't do.
The answer to your question is yes, those projects would not be eligible for this.
Okay,
program.
and so as long as you understand that
Those
some of the
projects
most
that are
important
currently
projects
being
around the
built,
state
yes, would not.
would
be
not
eligible.
qualify. And is that the objective? You know, they're also all, well, two of them are renovations.
Did folks on this particular piece, was there appetite to do the BEPC request to step to the TIF district excess tax mechanics? Or do folks want to keep exploring a concept like this? Just so I know what I'm doing.
Fair enough.
Although I realize more is to come, I recognize
And
that.
I would be happy to work with John on that as well. I could work with him over I can help you on Monday or.
I mean, I know how to do the which is what came from the Senate was the excess tax mechanics. So, but I appreciate the offer for sure.
You know, if we don't want to decide on that right now, it'd be nice to see what the language is, please.
We did, yeah.
But
It's
well,
in the first version of the.
well,
For the excess tax mechanics, yeah.
I think it makes sense.
You use the TIF district.
Agreed.
That takes in all, whether it's municipal bond or whether it's the sponsor.
The sponsor, I think, is the language that we would need from the, to make it workable for CHIP, because you're essentially, the municipality is the vehicle by which the increment is being
Flows through,
exactly.
flows to
Flows
and
to
either
and
to-
potentially
through the
through.
bond or through to the sponsor that is provided,
Right,
has taken on the debt.
that's right. So the increment is gonna come to the municipality. And then the municipality is either gonna use it to pay their own bond, or they're gonna use it to pay for infrastructure costs that the developer has borne.
So I maybe have a clarifying question here. In terms of needing language to address having a different sponsor, the way that I thought about this is the increment is going to an account that the muni has, and the only money that it is sending is what would be committed to financing in that year, in which case I'm assuming that any excess increment, which is that amount beyond what is committed, will necessarily be with the municipality in that account.
That's correct.
So is extra language needed to get it? That, I guess, okay, just making sure. Yep.
I think as long as because we've inserted this sponsor concept, but we've defined the sponsor concept in the statute and the definitions, that it's you could make it clear that it is the municipality that is receiving the increment, and the municipality has this responsibility of maintaining that fund, and the municipality will then have to account for, as part of their annual auditing, which is later in your statute, the amount of increment that is being paid to the sponsor
Okay.
in every year. And then
That
we would
makes sense.
have a true up at a 10-year mark to see how much we need to adjust, if any, the percentage of increment that the municipalities are taking.
Which is a mechanic we don't currently have. And that is something I understood the group to be. Okay.
And then at the end of the debt, once the debt's paid off,
All the,
all the rest of the money goes back into the ed.
right, in fact, I learned with
Whatever's being retained.
right, with Winooski, it actually, the money goes back to the treasurer.
Different like that.
We're on page 15, so we're gonna get there, but just practically my laptop will die relatively soon, so I would love to get through the remainder of this. If anyone has
Adele?
no.
It's a bill.
It doesn't rain.
I would need a USB-C. I'm okay for now, but if someone has yes, I do have a Dell. Let's see if this works.
There's a Dell power adapter.
I think it is living on this, so this is great. Thank you, Bill. I had similar hopes.
I can accommodate anyone.
So I can do those things. Let's see what else we have. On page 18, this is part of your information reporting section. You'll know that we have those annual pieces and then we have a 10-year. And what's proposed here is a 5-year check-in related to particular pieces. So this is same committees of jurisdiction, but to describe for each housing development site the change in assessed valuation. You would know this from the increment figures, but also the municipal grand list across the life of that housing infrastructure project. Just note that depending on how long these take to get off the ground, you may not have much information together at this point. The second piece of this, I would say, is maybe more substantive and different from the other kinds of information that you receive in the information reporting section. This is a check-in to see, is BEPC encountering problems? Basically, like what barriers are municipalities, developers, and sponsors encountering when trying to access this program, and providing considerations for updating the program to address any of those barriers. So it's kind of like, could we tweak this after 5 years if we discover that municipalities can't access this? So 5-year for that piece. I say 5 years, it's actually slightly less than that because it's January 15th of 2030. There is another piece here. At the very end, we're on page 22. Got a new section, 21A. Exciting stuff. This is replacing your location criteria. So you have currently tier 1A, tier 1B, and then you have an existing settlement. And this would be a contingently effective update. You would remove the existing settlement piece and replace with an area designated tier 2, provided that approval shall be granted only upon approval of any permits. Did you guys not want the removal of existing settlement?
Right.
Okay, well, I can keep that. That's easy to. I'd understood that. I think I don't understand the scope of the tiers, and I was assuming it was picked up by.
So settlement is the in-between terms.
Okay. So the concept here, you'd get tier two, and there's a proviso that approval be granted only upon approval of any permits required for the housing development. This is something I would need to talk to Ellen about. I just put this in as concept language. In briefly mentioning this to Ellen, she thought there might be issues, but I will have to talk to her to discover why this might be problematic to require this. And it may be that it's across the course of the construction of the project that you have to secure different things, in which case you may, right, you wouldn't want to stop a project from going. So I'll talk to her about this proviso, but note that there is this contingently effective tier two, and I'll retain the existing settlement piece.
I think the thought is that if there are projects out there currently that are in a tier two that are going through or have received Act 250 approval, that they could be eligible for CHIP until the maps come out.
Oh, you want this?
The existing settlement is the current in-between language for the area that will be called tier two. Probably. So
Okay,
that's
all
that
right.
part.
Yeah,
And then the question is, what do folks think about tier two areas that have a Act 250 permit? Can be considered for this program as well.
Just to be clear, the existing, those regimes would exist separate from this, right? So for anything to happen, you would have to secure the permitting. It's not as if getting a project through CHIP somehow exempts it from the
Right.
jurisdiction.
Exactly what we want.
not exactly, because in a tier two, if you have a project that's less than 10, then you don't need Act 250.
Oh.
You need local permitting, but you don't need Act 250.
Oh, is that what so this is trying to get at excluding that? You only want things that are subject to Act.
Right now.
So you would exclude the projects that are not where an Act 250
Until the maps come out.
I don't, what's the purpose of that, of excluding the smaller project?
Oh, no, it's just to build
Because-
a bridge.
It's to build the bridge until the maps come out. So if there's an existing project in the development in a tier two area that has Act 250 permitting, that CHIP could be used for that. And then remember, we were talking about tier two, and until the maps come out, we don't know where those areas, the building areas are in a tier two. So that's why we wanted to put an effective date
Sure,
out.
I get it.
But if there is any projects that are in the hopper now that get Act 250 permit,
Right.
that we could utilize CHIP for that.
But why wouldn't you say it, for those projects, yeah, utilize CHIP? But why wouldn't you also want to say, or is exempt from Act 250? Because those smaller projects are right now exempt from Act 250.
But there's been a determination that the project where that settlement is proposed to, there's other criteria in Act 250, right?
Yeah.
So I think that gets some people over the hump. Then, once the maps are out, then we have designated areas for those developments in tier two.
No, I get it, and let me think about, the delayed, because I see at the end, there's a delayed effective date for including tier two areas in
Right.
CHIP.
It's gonna do that anyway. We're
Right, and it's,
right. So this is a way to get a bridge to projects
Got it.
that could
Yeah.
utilize CHIP, that could get them over the hump
and
for
it's,
kind of more.
only a year delay.
Are we keeping that existing half
Yes,
mile?
yeah.
So we're
Yeah, yeah.
keeping, we're also,
Yeah,
we're
he
keeping
knows that.
the,
Yeah, we're
that
keeping
first
the
part.
existing settlement area.
Yeah,
So
within that
that,
half
that's
mile.
acting in place as tier two right now.
Right.
And how is
That's
this,
the bridge.
the old racetrack, the guy that came in, Fairhaven? Do we know where they sit with something like this? Are they,
I don't know if that, where,
Yes.
what tier that's in, if
He'd
it's
be
a,
in tier two, so he would not be allowed to utilize CHIP for at least 1 year.
unless it's a,
Unless he-
unless it's in, what we're proposing is that if he, is he looking at 10 or more buildings?
I don't remember that, and is it 10 or more buildings, or
It's
if it's
units.
mixed use, like if he had 10 units in one apartment building, would that,
I don't know, whatever triggers Act 250.
yeah. So my wheelhouse.
And also, I guess the other issue is that project and is it going right now?
No,
Because that's the major trigger is that they have to be in process.
He'd need Act 250 for that whole thing, right?
yes,
So he'd need Act 250 regardless.
So if he's going for Act 250,
Then he
he
can
could
just
be
jump.
eligible for it.
May I offer, just to clarify for my own self, I think part of what is maybe causing confusion is that this draft does not reflect that request. So here's what I understand is being requested. You have at the start, tier one, you have your first piece, you have existing settlement, and then there would be a third category.
Yeah.
Would be projects that have Act 250 approval now, regardless of where they are in the state. Is that the?
They have Act 250 approval prior to.
Okay, okay. And then what would happen, this contingently effective piece would actually be adding to that list, tier two, and it wouldn't come into effect until a year after the first designation is made, basically.
Although, right,
process question, as one admittedly who is not familiar with Act 250, but just thinking about this from a CHIP standpoint, when you have a TIP application come in or CHIP application come in, what we hear is time is the killer of all projects. And so if a developer and the municipality cannot come in to BEPC unless they have all of their Act 250 permitting completed, then they're not gonna be able to access this program, which means that they're potentially delaying
So
the
Jess,
project,
just,
right?
so in tier two?
Yeah.
Any project now or going forward,
Yeah,
if it's more than, if it's 10 units or more, or it's 10 acres, I think, or whatever, it still is going to need Act 250. So the Act 250 exemption is in 1A and 1B.
gotcha. Okay,
So what we're saying is if they already have a 250 permit and they want to access CHIP
Yeah.
in that delay period, then they can apply.
And then on the contingently effective, as I'm understanding it, tier two is available broadly, agnostic as to if they have an existing set of Act 250 permits. It's just, so I'll list them again. This is the way I understand it. At the start of the program, you'd have the tier one piece, you'd have existing settlement, and then you'd have this third category, someone who has their Act 250 permits in place. And then a year following the first designation of tier two area, you would have a new category, tier two. And it wouldn't speak to if someone had an Act 250 permit in place for that tier two piece. That's how I'm understanding it. You'd have 3 location criteria to start with and then 4.
okay.
That's how I understand it.
I can, that's great information. Thank you for this, because I want to go back and talk to others within ACCD through DHCD that might understand this restriction potentially limiting municipalities from being able to engage with developers to create
Yeah.
a district.
I guess, no, that makes sense. The thinking to me is you're creating an extra category, that it's not limiting, it's actually like you would, if you didn't have this, at least at the start, you'd just have the interim housing exemption.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's,
I could imagine too, that, I mean, to your point about timing, is that, let's say down the road, there's a Act 250 application that involves housing, on land, they could simultaneously be engaging Betsy about, they just they just wouldn't be, you wouldn't be able to approve their application until they had an Act 250 permit.
And yeah, and also the purpose of a lot of this is to concentrate the development in the exempted areas, so zone two is generally kind of, or tier two is kind of,
I guess when I,
Act 250 is always gonna be there.
when we started this, the purpose was to make it housing accessible to rural areas in Vermont. And if we are going to continue to hold place for our most rural areas to create housing, those areas are not going to be within in the tier 1A, 1B, as I understand, areas. And so what we've also heard is that the rural communities need housing desperately because they don't have the infrastructure to create the housing.
Within this committee, we don't have any jurisdiction over Act
That's the
250.
thing.
So for Act 250, that's just a parallel permitting process.
Yeah.
All right, let's see if we can button this up. You have a question?
Well, I'm just trying to understand where we're at in this
Good, that's what I
process.
was just about to do. So go ahead.
Because
Get us,
and I don't want to belabor it because I think people need to get out of here.
we have to get it done.
I,
Tuesday's our deadline, so let's
Well,
get it done.
I understand.
We can order pizza and be.
Well, I'm up for it. I'm fine. I'm fine with that. Because if necessary, I'll talk about,
Wind us up. Wind us up. Get us to the question.
All right. I'd rather see the effective date of tier 2 as July 1, 2027. Because the definitions are going to be, things are going to be created December 31, 2026, and I'd rather see that effective date is July 1, 2027. I'd also like to see a small development exemption. I think we've talked about that, but we haven't really, come to any consensus around that. I don't know whether you want to try to do that now or later. Those are my two.
I'm not sure what a small development exemption means.
Okay.
And when you're thinking about it, think about it statewide, big town, small town, all of that, right? So okay, go ahead, go.
So, some of the criteria that we've been talking about, we haven't really seen. There's 2 areas, maybe 3 areas where this is going to be relevant. One is in the excess, different excess retention. We've been talking about, I don't remember exactly where we landed up on affordability and infrastructure. But if there are going to be some differentials around that. I think they're going to be too complicated for small developers to be able to satisfy. And so I think it makes sense to have an exemption for some number of units that you think is appropriate, that their projects would still be eligible.
For 80%.
Well, I think,
Because.
I can't remember the difference.
So-
So
understand.
70%
There's 70%,
increment
70, 80,
at 70, 85,
right?
anybody's eligible. Any size development is eligible.
Yeah. and
Any size development, any income is eligible.
Right, and I'm just saying that a smaller developer is not going to be able to access the higher excess retention.
What?
Because
Lower, I guess.
because they won't be building affordable housing.
They won't be able to go through the process of showing that they're developing affordable housing, correct? They may be, in fact, developing affordable housing, but they won't be able to manage.
Oh,
You might be the only one who thinks that on the committee.
Okay.
yeah, I don't agree.
So I'm not seeing folks nodding along.
Okay, all right.
I don't put words in anybody's mouth, but
Okay, I just think
No,
that,
I can see it. I can understand what you're saying. I think something that maybe we're running up against is also just the professionalization of development period, like it's a really.
It's a municipality, don't forget, right?
Yeah.
A developer working
Working
with
with
the
the
municipality
municipality, but you,
and an
like-
RPC probably,
RPC.
and other folks, right?
Like-
This is not something that anybody is taking on alone.
oh, and I didn't mean to
I'm
imply
saying
that,
for her too.
okay, yeah, I didn't mean to imply that, but. I do, I think to Edie's point, I think that, there are gonna be ways that we will be able to help support developers, even smaller rural developers with all of this paperwork and everything. It may not be in this bill exactly, but I think there,
Yeah.
I think there are ways, because we're gonna need to also train new developers too.
I totally agree with you. And it might not be in this bill. But that would be my concern that if we're not, the smaller developers
Mhm.
are gonna be the ones that are gonna create actual housing in some of these rural towns.
Yeah.
And if we don't have a program that's suited for them, then those houses aren't gonna be built.
Well, the lower end of the program will allow them to use the program. It's the higher, the level 2. Which, and you're talking about small developers. We're talking about people who have what, a couple $1 million to work with? Are they really gonna have the resources to build that much affordable housing, even if we gave them that tier 2
They
level?
are able to build.
Okay,
this
so
better.
let's just scrap the 2 different tiers. And we're gonna go 70, 85, and that's it.
No affordable housing criteria, no extra anything.
If that's hanging everybody up, then let's just.
Well, maybe just me.
Affordable houses also.
I have faith in Betsy to make those decisions.
What were you thinking about definition of infrastructure improvements?
Let's finish this first.
Yeah.
But just they're related. To me,
They are.
in my mind.
Well, I mean, if we're gonna scrap that idea, then we just go back to what we had for infrastructure improvement. Because there's no need of,
Yeah.
identifying an incentive, because we're,
Right.
so.
The yesterday's draft concept of improvements, which was an exhaustive list of,
No,
no, you want to return to the Senate version. Okay.
You just take the word transportation out and have it be roads and
Yeah.
bridges and parking. Transportation is, just because it's the old term that was used in.
Okay.
I think
Doesn't-
it's,
Okay.
Say what we need. Don't mean a flying car.
well,
Nice.
a landing pad.
First time I've been excited today.
Well, debate it right there. You could fly to work. Make you a pad on the roof.
I take advantage of that.
I bet you would. Okay, where else are we?
Okay. Percent of housing development? Percent, do we want to have a percent?
I really think we need one.
Yeah,
I'm fine, I can go with the 40% if that's where people wanna be, but you have to tell me what you're. I'm hearing that people weren't comfortable with 60, is that?
I'm good with 40. That was a good one.
I like 40 because of the 2-story situation. If the bottom level is all commercial or medical or whatever, and then
And that can
you automatically kicks in.
more or lessen the need for that board to have to.
right.
So maintaining the board, but reducing to 40%, and the idea is that does reduce demand on the board to make.
Unless Jess comes back that VHFA wants to do it.
Well, is it that VHFA would write a letter or would it be?
Well, I think it's pretty much the same thing. If they write the letter, they're saying, the letter is saying it's a good project, right? So.
Right,
I mean, I'm fine with that.
Okay, what about another affordable housing partner like an Evernorth or looking at like other affordable housing developers throughout the state.
Doesn't, I'm not thinking it's not about affordable housing, it's just about
Oh, right.
if you're under 40%.
Mm.
Then it would, you know, and there's things that are wrong. There's reasons why it's under 40%. Are they good reasons?
Sure. Yeah,
And because the housing,
Sure.
this is housing, the house. She
Yeah.
does house, the VHFA does housing.
Yeah.
They can say, they can give you a letter that they're
Be part
they're
of
cool
the-
with it, right?
right. And that would just be one part of the CHIP application for Betsy to consider.
Would the-
Not it's not as though VHFA would be the sole arbiter of making that.
Right, but if they came in and said, no,
Right,
then you're gonna have to, and you do it, then you're gonna have to come back to us and you're gonna have
right,
to tell us, these are the reasons why.
right. And I just think that doesn't make a lot of sense, and that the council,
Well, they might feel that if it comes in at 25%, they may feel that that project doesn't provide enough housing. Right? Because I mean, if they're coming under the percentage,
yeah,
and they're utilizing some commercial property in order to make it pencil out.
yep,
And so it may be felt that we were providing chip for more commercial than housing.
right,
And housing is the main focus.
right.
Right.
I mean,
And just, this is after we've gotten the blessing of the planning commission, the select board, and the regional planning commission as well.
But it's still state dollars that are being utilized that we need to focus on as well.
Is this maintaining the border or are we switching to a VHFA? Okay, okay.
Well, unless Jess has magic.
I just learned about my magical potential powers today.
But you can, if you can
But I will-
chat with Maura.
Yeah.
To see if you can come up with something that she's comfortable with.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I think. I mean, I'd much rather take it off of your plate.
Yeah.
In making those decisions, so that it's not something that comes back to us that we have to then,
right.
right?
Right, and that there's some sort of, that we made a decision that was contrary to the legislative intent. And I can appreciate that and, am thankful for the committee's desire to, protect Betsy members from that. So I will absolutely talk to Maura and, because this was the first I had heard of it, and I
Yep.
think we can also talk to DHCD. Yeah, maybe talk to Alex as well and potentially put forth an alternative that would make everyone happy. Because if Maura is not happy with the letter, she doesn't want to have that accountability, maybe there's other solutions that at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, none of us have thought of.
Just, yeah, I just.
Yeah.
Caution on making sure that it's not. For anybody on the board.
On Betsy Council, correct? Yes, yes.
Where do we end up on improvements, eligible improvements?
We're going back to the language that came over.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions, John?
Oh, me to have questions?
You have enough?
Like, how dare you? Let me flip through real quick. Comfort level, well, for the housing infrastructure agreement, we're maintaining a term, but just related to primary residence and not to affordable housing. Is that what I'm understanding? Because folks are cool with the primary residence concept that's built in there? Okay.
Fine with that.
Is that permanent? Primary residence,
It's throughout the life of the housing development site. So until the financing is retired.
Life of the loan.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I see.
So it's not a
So it's
permanent
not-
requirement.
It's
It's
not limited.
time limited.
It's not indefinite, but it's
Not
time.
definite, but it would be presumably somewhat substantial. And tied to the benefit that you're gaining from the program, basically, like there's a natural link.
Unless there's an affordability. And it's within the affordability clause. It depends on who's doing it. If it's coming from, the HCB is doing a project, and they have their own criteria, right?
Sure.
As far as CHIP goes. Yeah, then someone can take their unit, turn it into an Airbnb if you want, right? Or turn it into a vacation home.
Well, except that.
After the loan.
What is it?
I feel pretty good with what I have right now.
Okay, if there's, Jess, you're available, if there's questions that you have, John,
Absolutely.
on, as far as
He has my contact information.
how to structure the
Mechanics or, yep.
retainage. Anybody else want to do anything else? Everybody needs to get home tonight, Susan. Committee's on a roll now. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, 9 o'clock Tuesday, 398, they're working on the amendment for that. And then, we'll have John in, and when we finish that, to go until we have to go to the floor to start looking at the amendment. And then when we come back at 1, we're gonna discuss the amendment. I've got 2 hours posted for that. That in those 2 hours, I'm hoping that we can take our straw vote. And then, S-117, hopefully we can finish that up and get that moved out. Okay,
Busy day.
okay. Well, thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend. Thanks for your work.
Thanks for hanging in.
Just thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I like your.
Have a good